welcome everybody to the PID webinar. As you know, PID tries to introduce to you the best people in the world and the best people in Pakistan to try and generate a domestic economics debate and a policy debate. Unfortunately, in this country, we haven't had one. So PID is trying very hard to generate that. Today, I must say I'm especially honored to welcome my former professor from Chicago, Deirdre McCloskey. Probably one of the best way to describe her, that she is a Renaissance economist. She's probably not just the very, very fine economist, but a well-rounded Renaissance figure as well. When you read her books, you have this feeling that this lady has read and absorbed almost all the classical as well as the neoclassical literature and can master those facts and those models beautifully. So Deirdre McCloskey taught us price theory in Chicago. And I must say we were all the better off for it. She was a very instructor, a tough person to mark our sheets. I still remember she used to tell us, if you want your paper rechecked, remember it can go both ways. Both up and down. So none of us approached her for rechecking the paper because we were absolutely scared that our grade would go down. But nevertheless, she really did a great job at price theory. Her book is a classic. That was a great book. I was honored to read the book in manuscript form, not just the printed form. She ran the manuscript through us. And the problem sets were especially challenging and interesting. But since then, Deirdre McCloskey has not only challenged the economic establishment in terms of the way she looks at economic history, but also in terms of the way she looks at econometrics. So she launched a great debate in econometrics too, on the significance tests and on the way we do econometrics. Now, most recently, she started challenging the economic establishment in terms of growth theory. And she started interpreting how the Industrial Revolution took place. A 3-volume set, Bourgeois Values, Bourgeois Dignity, Bourgeois Destiny, is a treat. As I said, it's a masterful sweep of the history of ideas. And this is a question that really Professor McCloskey has challenged me in my life. And I'm glad you've chosen this subject. How ideas change the world, and I would love to hear your views on this. How have ideas shaped history, and how we have shaped ourselves in terms of fitting into the idea world. So I have lots of questions on this, but before I raise any of them, I want you to tell us what you think, then we'll go forward. So welcome, Deirdre McCloskey. Welcome, and thank you very much for giving PID your precious time.
Thank you very much. That was an accurate, well, at least flattering summary of my career. I'm speaking to you from Chicago, where I've lived since 2000. A long time ago, I was at the University of Chicago, also in Chicago, for a long time. And so I've spent most of my life in Chicago, most of my adult life. But I'm going to go this week, actually, to the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., for a full-time job. I'm 80 years old, so it's very nice to be back in the labor force, earning a salary. So my theme these days, in fact, it's been developing for a long time, since really the 1980s, is that ideas, the conceptions we have of society, are what run history. So there are some easy examples, Marx being an extremely important one, or indeed Adam Smith. I'm an Anglican, so whenever I mention Adam Smith, I cross myself in the Christian way. So the ideas of these people, other people, are what drive the economy. I mean, think of it in terms of just ordinary economic behavior. If you want to start a new hairdressing salon in your neighborhood, if you're not prevented by some law, and if you're not prevented by conspiracies by your competitors, this idea you have that maybe this neighborhood needs another hairdressing salon, I certainly need one, is an innovation. So innovation doesn't need to be big. It doesn't need to be personal computers or the steam engine or something like that. The little ideas can become big, but in any case, millions of ideas, little ideas, can result in economic growth, economic development, improvement. So the idea that ideas are important is not just about the great overarching ideas of the world's history. In the last 3 centuries, thinking of politics and economy, the 3 biggest ideas, the big overarching ideas, have been liberalism, which came to Northwestern Europe as an idea really in the 18th century, in the 1700s. And then in the early 1800s, and again in Europe, the idea of nationalism. And then in the middle of the 19th century, the 1800s, the idea of socialism. Those 3 are the big governing, so to speak, ideas of the modern world. And I think only the first one is a good one. The other 2, nationalism and socialism, have caused great damage in the world. Whereas the idea that individuals should be free is one that we can all agree on, even if we think we don't. And it's been all to the good that women could be free to pursue careers in the marketplace is a liberal idea, and it has been an enormously important economic event in the last, say, 80 years or so. So ideas matter, and there can be bad ideas along with good ideas. Usually in the economy, well, I shouldn't say usually, I should say almost always, the economic ideas that are going to be helpful are self-evaluating. If you decide to open that hairdressing salon I mentioned, and it turns out to be a bad idea, that people don't need another one in the neighborhood, you'll go bankrupt. This is the Chicago school idea that I taught when I was teaching graduate students at the University of Chicago. Entry and exit is the key Chicago idea. Maximization is the key Harvard idea. That was where I was first educated. But at Chicago, we emphasized entry and exit. And exit happens. If you make a big mistake economically, you are punished for it. Now, the trouble with nationalism and socialism is that when a nation makes a mistake, or when a social planner makes a mistake, the mistake tends to keep happening. If Pakistan and India fight over territory, or that goes on for decades. If the debate over Kashmir was about economics, so to speak, was about enterprise, it would long since have been decided one way or the other by entry and exit. Whereas violent entry and exit is the problem of nationalism. So, I often make the joke. You understand that the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s was called so because in German it means National Socialism. National Socialism. So I often make the joke that if you like nationalism and like socialism, maybe you'll like National Socialism as well. Whereas the liberal idea has worked. And my claim is that liberty, the liberty movement, you might call it, since 1776, famous for the publication of The Wealth of Nations and for the American Revolution, that movement is what made us rich in the modern world. It wasn't planning. It wasn't state projects that made us rich. And it, surprisingly, I also say, it wasn't saving and investment, the sort of argument I was taught at Harvard, the Herod-Domar model and all that. It wasn't investment. And it certainly was not, that is, the enrichment of places like England, wasn't the result of exploiting the Indian subcontinent. It was not colonialism that made the West rich. It was innovation. So it was not from sort of the right wing investment, those virtuous rich people who save a lot and then invest and then we all become rich. That's not what caused the modern world. There had always been investment. The great irrigation systems of very early economic history in Pakistan, in the South, were great investments, but didn't result in modern economic growth, didn't result in this enormous leap in income with which you in Pakistan are very familiar. The Pakistani income per head is perhaps, I don't know what it is these days, but maybe $10 a day per person. Whereas in Switzerland, income per head per day is more like is $180 a day per person. So it's that enormous leap that we need to explain. It's peculiarly modern, and my argument that I make in my books, especially as you pointed out, my recent books, by which I mean the last 6 or 7 books, is that it was ideas, the idea of liberty that made people bold, that made them willing, for the sake of their children, to venture on inventing the steam engine or to venture on opening the hairdressing salon. So it's neither the virtuous rich saving nor the evil imperialists or exploitative manufacturers in Lancashire. Those right-wing and left-wing theories are wrong. What's correct, I think, what is correct economic history and correct economics is to argue that if you let people innovate, they do. And I don't think there's any obstacle. Of course, I'm no expert on Pakistan, though I've long observed from the outside your country. I don't know the details of Pakistan except in the cricket. I'm a big fan. Um, there's no real serious cultural obstacle to Pakistan becoming rich. How do I know this? Well, because it's happened in Botswana, in Africa, in Hong Kong, in China, in South Korea, indeed in the land of my ancestors, in Ireland. First time I saw Ireland up close was in 1967, and the Irish Republic then was, I like to say, still a third world country, because they had attempted after independence to impose socialism, and it didn't work. Then in the last 40 years or so, Ireland has enormously enriched. The next time I was in Ireland, O'Connell Street in Dublin was thronged with well-to-do Irish people, 1996. So from 1967, when I first saw it, to 1996 was a tripling, a quadrupling of income per head. And the same can happen in Pakistan. And the key, I think, is to let people alone. Now, here's the problem. Attempting to leap directly to Swedish-style socialism, which is the idea that lots of people educated in the West have, is a mistake. It's what India tried to do after independence till 1991, constantly trying to achieve equality. And large-scale government intervention in the economy to achieve development. Neither of these work unless you've allowed enterprise, the inventions and the reallocations that leaving people alone achieve. Until you're Sweden, you can't do Swedish socialism. I heard a couple of months ago at the Cato Institute, the place I'm going to move to for employment this week, the former elected president, I forget whether it's president or prime minister, they call him, in Tunisia speaking. And he's been overthrown by a coup in the last couple of years, which was a terrible thing to happen. You've seen it happen in Pakistan too. But he said, when I was in office, he said, for a couple of years, I tried to bring equality to Tunisia. Now, you will recall that the suicide of a street vendor in Tunisia started the so-called Arab Spring, which alas didn't amount to very much, in Tunisia, and then in Egypt and in other places in the Arab world. And he said, this shall we call him, the president said, well, we tried to leap directly by government planning to Swedish socialism. And the trouble is that if you try to do that, if you bring the state in a large way into the economy, all you do is create tremendous opportunities for corruption. as the Indians said, perhaps you have the same phrase in Pakistan, you end up with a license raj, a rule of people who can say no to you, who can stop you from having electricity in your home, or stop you from opening that hairdressing salon, or stop you from inventing in a way that might compete with existing institutions, stop you from importing Kellogg's cornflakes into India, which is what actually happened. Not very important case, but it was the case that under the license Raj, Kellogg's cornflakes couldn't be imported into India. And of course, that meant that the equivalent of cornflakes, cold cereal, you pour some milk on it, in India was very bad. It wasn't a good product. And then after 1991 and Singh and his friends, India opened up to some degree, not entirely, and Kellogg's cornflakes was allowed into India. And the quality of breakfast cereal was enormously improved. So it's not by the state and its planning that we're going to get rich. I've been almost everything in my life. I've been a socialist, a Keynesian, a social engineer, an Austrian economist, a Chicago school economist. And when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, my senior thesis was called Road and Rail in India, a input-output study. Now, understand, this is a 20-year-old is going to write a thesis at Harvard College for the honors program to advise the Indian government. The idea is absurd that this kid could do it. And this dissertation, which I still have a copy of, I'm going to patent it as a sleep aid. If you have insomnia, you can buy my senior thesis and start reading it. And I guarantee you within 3 minutes, you'll be asleep. And it was an input-output study because at Harvard in the 1960s, input-output was the big idea. Leontief's input-output way of looking at the economy, fixed coefficients. And the absurdity of planning is well illustrated in this thesis of mine. The best way to decide on road versus rail in India would be to privatize the rail system and let the road system, automobiles and trucks, compete with the rail system. And if, as in the United States, we use railroads still for freight on a massive scale, but passenger rail in the United States is practically non-existent because with the interstate system, automobiles are a much better way for families to get around. So the key idea is liberty, not equality. If you leap immediately to equality of outcome, that's straightforward central planning socialism. It's like the Soviet Union or Maoist China, or still North Korea. And to say that it doesn't work is an understatement. Thoroughgoing equality, claimed equality of outcome is a bad policy and results in massive misallocations. And of course, what it mainly results in, as I said before, is corruption. So even the equality of outcome, the equality of income, isn't achieved. In the old Soviet Union, it was not true that people were equal. They equal in incomes. The top members of the Communist Party had better vacation homes and higher incomes and better automobiles than the ordinary worker did. Even though the ideology, the superficial justification of communism was equality of outcome. But, by the way, families are communist enterprises and should be. You don't make your child go out to work to pay for lunch. You in a family, in a loving family, it is from each according to her ability, to each according to his need, and that's appropriate. And that's why central planning socialism is attractive to teenagers. I was a socialist when I was 16 years old because I came from a middle-class family, and daddy's income dropped on us from something called the office, of which I had no conception, and then we shared it out equally. So we'll always have this problem as long as we have families, and that will always be true of humans. We'll always have this problem that teenagers live in a socialist economy called a family. Then you can say in a more moderate way, instead of equality of outcome, you can talk about equality of opportunity. And that sounds nice, and it sounds less centrally planned. We'll just give people subsidies for education or for health, and then there'll be equality of opportunity. But the trouble is that too is not attainable. Real equality of, look, we have varied gifts. Where some of us are more beautiful than others, some are better at fast bowling than others. Some can bowl googlies and some can't. Some people are taller than others. Some people have better parents than others. Some people come from this part of the country or that part of the country. Some people are Parsis and some are Muslims. You see what I mean? The personal history of people and their native abilities, what's between their head or in their arms, varies. And to achieve real equality of opportunity, we would need to pound nails into the heads of smart people to make them as stupid as I am, or deface women who are more beautiful than I am in order to achieve equality of opportunity. So equality of opportunity it sounds good, but it's not a good idea. So what do I mean by liberalism? I mean equality of permission. That's the key point. Not equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity, but equality of permission. And that means leaving people alone. I'm not an anarchist. I don't believe we should have no government at all. Because as Thomas Hobbes said long ago, that might lead, although I think he exaggerated, but might lead to the war of all against all, and the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. No, I believe in the state, But I believe in a small state, perhaps taking 10% of national income and being very moderate in regulating the rest of the market or society, having a state without great military ambitions except national defense. Now, I admit that Pakistan lives in a rough neighborhood. There's India to the south, China to the east, Iran to the west. You need a military to defend yourself. But of course, the problem is with militaries is that they tend to get ambitions beyond their proper role, as you've seen in the history of Pakistan. But in any case, aside from this small government devoted to protecting you against foreign aggression, one, two, protecting individuals against individual coercions, thieves and violent people. Aside from that, the government should leave you alone. Incidentally, one kind of invasion that I think a central government does need to be involved in is the spread of disease, epidemic disease. There's a case for coercion by the central government in getting people vaccinated for polio, measles, smallpox, and COVID. But that shouldn't be used as an excuse to intervene in everything that people do. And that's the temptation of a powerful government. So a small government, and for the most part, leave people alone. Now, this is impractical, this proposal I'm making, because we have large governments now, large armies in Pakistan, large armies in my own country, large intervention by the government. Even in the United States, which is supposed to be such a free marketplace, 40% of the national income is spent by one or another level of government, federal, state, and local. 40%, 40 cents out of every dollar is spent in either buying goods and services or giving subsidies to people like me. I'm an old person. I have socialized medicine. Americans say, no, we don't want socialized medicine, except for we old people. I always thank young audiences in the United States for giving me 2 hip replacements free. I paid nothing for them. So that's the socialized medicine that the young people don't get. So in any case, there should be a small government competent to protect us. But then there's always the danger that it'll expand. So my job as a liberal economist, as a classical liberal economist, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Milton Friedman, indeed, is to urge the government and urge my fellow citizens to stop expanding the government. There's a recent book by Ashimoglu and Robinson, 2019, called The Narrow Corridor. And it's in some ways a wonderful book. It's very well written and documented and so on. And I did a long review of it, a very long review, some 30 pages. And I came to the conclusion that the book is basically a statist tract. It's in favor, the opposite of liberalism is statism. The idea that if we have a large, complicated modern economy, we need large, complicated modern regulation of the economy. That's false. From an Austrian economic point of view, it's rather the opposite of the truth. The more complicated the economy, the less is it a good idea for people in Islamabad to govern the economy. So what we liberals, I'd speak of myself, want is to at least restrain the further expansion of the government. Ashimoglu and Robinson have a vision of larger and larger government, which they claim will achieve liberty. And here I think I'll make one more point and then conclude, and we can have a conversation about these ideas. There's a problem in English. I'd be interested to know if it's true in Urdu. I think it's not, because in every language I've inquired into, what I'm about to say is not the case. In English, recently, the last 150 years, the two words for liberty have diverged. There's the French and ultimately Latin word liberty. That's one word we have in English. But we also have the Germanic word freedom. In German, it's Freiheit. And in English, because of the Norman conquest of 1066, we very frequently, as you may have noticed, have two words for everything. Cow and beef, for example. And this is the case. Up until the middle of the 19th century or so, these two words meant the same thing. They meant civil freedom, not being a serf or a slave. I mean, in the Roman or Germanic world, that's exactly what they meant. And up till then they started to diverge. And especially in the last 100 years, the word freedom in English has come to mean having a high income as well. It means freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, gender freedom, et cetera, et cetera. It means those things. But it's also come to mean freedom to, get on an airplane and ride in the airplane to London, or to have a big house, or to have a lot of health care. The freedom to be rich, or to be adequately rich. So my friendly acquaintance, Amartya Sen, and my closer acquaintance, Martha Nussbaum, have written in the Indian context, the South Asian context, and more generally, about development as freedom. And this is a basic confusion. I believe that civil liberty, leaving people alone, allowing them to have equality, strict equality enforced by the government of permission, not of opportunity or outcome, leads to development, leads to enrichment. I think the whole history of the world in the last couple of centuries has shown this to be true. But to make capabilities, as Amartya and Martha say, mean the same thing as civil liberty. Putting them together, saying, oh, they're just the same, is to make the scientific hypothesis, which I believe is true, that civil liberty leads to enrichment, meaningless, because you've already put your conclusion into the premise of your argument. So there's a deep confusion, I think, in thinking about development. I suppose I should then make one more very large claim and very large point, and then truly end. And that is that the only necessary and sufficient condition for economic development is liberty, this kind that I'm talking about, and that the word both freedom and liberty once meant. We can think that, say, education is the way forward for Pakistan. Now, I'm in the industry. Was a professor for many years, and I'm in favor. Your battery is running low. Wait a second. I've got a problem with my. Oh, I see. Okay. I'm in favor of education. I want everyone to be educated. But if you let people start the hairdressing salon, if you let people move for work, if you let people transport things by truck wherever they want and sell them anywhere, then their children will get educated. And their grandchildren will be even more educated. How do I know this? Well, when people move to the United States, that's what happens. They come here, the immigrants work as clerks in grocery stores or as drivers of taxis, and their children, and especially their grandchildren, end up going to university. If you leave people alone and let them work, don't restrict their employment, don't restrict entrepreneurs, then you get education. Healthcare, the same point. Yes, of course, government intervention to stop plagues of polio and so forth I accept that. But it's much better to let people buy healthcare when as they can. If we obsess about being equal right from the beginning, we're making this mistake of leaping to Swedish-style socialism. Although, I've worked in Sweden, and Sweden is not as socialist as you might think. It's a capitalist economy, if you want to use that kind of foolish word. So I claim that the liberty movement is what that idea, and it's just an idea, made the world rich. And it can make Pakistan and South Africa and Brazil and other places that I care for also rich. The other methods, the 5-year plans, the interventions, the very alarming ideas of Mariana Mazzucato that the government should be a very active encourager of innovation. This is a very bad idea because they don't know in Washington or Islamabad what the best next economic move is. And to put them in charge of it is a very bad idea. We don't need more government intervention. We need less government intervention. We need liberated individuals.
Thank you, Professor McCloskey. To kick it off, let me just ask you a very simple question. Since you are one of the best economic historians and you've done a lot of work on the history of ideas, can I just ask you to speak to the kind of a related or twin issue, the evolution of the thought of liberty since Locke's liberty, equality, pursuit of happiness, etc., to now, and related to that, the role of the government. I mean, you've talked about the role of government in a very narrow liberal economist sense, where you're saying that, hey, it's protecting against foreign investment, protecting against domestic things. Over time, the role of government has evolved enormously, especially in terms of now the way we perceive government with all the UN resolutions and all the international commitments that we have. And related to that also is the issue that we believe now, in the old days, there was no real infrastructure that is required. Now, for example, roads, railways, or at least even the stock market, etc., the rules and the institutions are run by the government. So how do you see that evolving over time?
Well, you're perfectly right that people have come to believe in infrastructure investment by government and regulation of the stock market and so forth. There's no question about that. We're all statists now, but I'm saying that it's been a bad idea. Now I understand that's hard to believe, because you think, well, the government guarantees elementary education and pays for it. Therefore, that must be the only way to achieve elementary education. But in fact, if you look back in the economic history of the part of the world that started all this, where liberalism started, Northwestern Europe, it's the other way around. People started educating their children when they became not rich. I keep using the word rich, and I don't mean that. I mean just when they started to have higher income, one of the things they did was to take their children out of the labor force, child labor, which I know is a very serious problem in Pakistan, and put them into school. So it was not that the government forced people into school and that's what caused people to be able to read. It was the other way around. And that's generally the case, that that's why it's important to get the economic history right. Because if you think that the modern world became rich because of state action, I think you're making a mistake. Let's take the case of infrastructure. Let me tell you briefly about a historical example. Canal building in the United States in the 1830s, as long ago as that. Internal improvements is the phrase. Canal building in the United States was financed by state governments, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so forth, put money into building canals in the United States. The most famous one was the Erie Canal in northern New York State, but there were hundreds of miles of canals built in the 1830s, and it was a terrible idea. The Erie Canal was a fine idea, and that worked. Most of them failed. And the reason they failed is that shortly, actually really at the same time, the railways were expanding. And railways were a much better way to move both passengers and freight than most canals. So there you have an example of internal improvements, of infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is usually best done privately. For instance, in Britain, the canal age was in the 1790s, 40 years before it happened in Sweden and the United States. And it was done privately, more or less entirely privately. You had to have government permission to exercise the right of way to buy up the property to have the canal, but it was not subsidized by the government. And English the canals in Britain were economically successful because it was long before the development of the railway. So it's not at all clear that infrastructure projects have worked. My friend Bill Easterly has a wonderful example from Ghana, where he points out that the World Bank financed investments in an enormous artificial lake in Ghana, which was supposed to give them electric power to extract aluminum from the ore they had there, failed completely. It was built. What it did was produce waterborne diseases, and it was a catastrophe. So little mistakes are characteristic of a free economy. Big mistakes are characteristic of a statist economy. The worst environmental disasters in the world have happened in centrally planned economies.
But let me also raise this question. Think about it in terms of two different externalities. One is climate change, as you know, people talk about it a lot, that it requires government without action. We can't solve the climate change problem. The second one is also equally important, that the only entity that is capable of taking the risk in big ticket items, such as, for example, basic science, the Human Genome Project, or the space exploration project, is the government. That the private sector, in fact, may not be capable of doing it, or cannot have the long-term vision to be able to do it. How would you react to that?
Well, the long-term vision is often mistaken. Let's admit that, because you know that individual planners in the central government are not all wise, but this externality problem. Express it this way: in the last 100 years, economists have been increasingly inventing new externalities. The old one was monopoly, enterprise monopoly. Therefore, we needed antitrust. Then there was network economies, natural monopolies. Therefore, we need regulation of electricity. Then there were environmental externalities. So we need the government to tell us to regulate the environment. Then there, as you said, the space exploration externality. Externality. I wrote a paper some years ago looking into this matter a little bit. And I came to the somewhat surprising conclusion that for most of these externalities, no economist has ever measured them. This is a quantitative point. My friends who study informational externalities, for example, have never shown that informational externalities, I know more than you do, so I can take advantage of you, say that let's informational asymmetry is how it's expressed in economics. None of them, from George Akerlof on down, has shown that nationally, A, it's important, and B, that the government can fix it. It's just not been shown. And I find this to be a scientific scandal. If an astronomer were to propose a theory of the formation of galaxies and didn't include a rough estimate of the quantitative forces involved, no one would believe her. She would be laughed out of astronomy. Whereas economists feel free to think up another externality and say, aha, therefore the government should intervene. Now, that's a sequence of argument which at every stage is mistaken. You have to prove that it's quantitatively important to begin with, the externality. Then you can't just assume that an all-wise government can intervene and fix it. Let's take the case of COVID. Yes, there's a case for government intervention. I agree. But is the Chinese policy the correct one? I would say not. That is the under Xi Jinping, the crazy policy in China against COVID didn't work. Actually, an even more striking example is Australia, which had, like China, a closing down policy. But meanwhile, they didn't buy the vaccine. The closing down for 2 weeks or a month makes sense to me if, in the meantime, you buy the vaccine and then get everyone to use it. They didn't. But the same happened in China. So look, externality is not an argument ender, scientifically speaking and policy speaking. Just because you can dream up another externality doesn't mean it's big and doesn't mean that that the government should take care of it.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Ahmed.
Yes, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Yeah, this is Nadim's policy.
Yeah,
He doesn't like good-looking men to be seen. He thinks he's the best-looking man around on earth. So
Then we should deface him to make him equal to you.
yeah, that was my basic premise. But Professor, what an amazing set of ideas. I'm sorry I haven't read your books, but I was just, I've been introduced to a new person. But I did read Asimoglu's book, especially the latest one, and Nadim brought him on. I do agree on, statism. I have a question, being way dumber, though better looking than Nadim, that actually when you talk of equality of permissions, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be a match, in my mind, with equality of control. Because
right.
The role of religion, whether revealed or natural, and I won't even go into your amazing differentiation between liberty. I do believe that liberty in history of economics emerges from more religious context than freedom, as you mentioned in German. So to me, what do you say today for a state like Israel, a state like Pakistan, and to name a few, where do you put this religion? Because religion, this whole thing, I don't think religion and terrorism is an externality of sorts that the economists have been able to plug, like the asymmetry of information. So, I mean, I didn't hear much about religion and the role of state, and is religion something outside the boundaries of our thought, or how does...
No.
Because it opposes the whole concept of equality of permissions.
Yeah, well, I don't think so. I think the religion, with its origin in a merchant of Mecca, or the religion with its origin in a carpenter of Israel, is anything other than an egalitarianism of permission. Now, modern Islam, recent Islam, really, of course, I'm a historian, so when I say recent, I mean the last few hundred years, has made an alliance with the state with bad results. I'm actually just finishing for the University of Chicago Press, I hope, they haven't quite agreed to it, a book called, what's it called now? God's Economy, Public Theology for an Age of Innovism. And it's a full defense of the proposition that Christianity, like Islam, like Hinduism, like whatever you want to name, is consistent with economic and political liberalism. So it's not. I think you can agree with me that it's not Islam itself that's the problem. It's the alliance of Islam with the state that's the problem, such as in in Malaysia, or as you point out, especially in view of the last election in Israel, or indeed in the history of Christianity in the West, where it was the look, when Islam ran Spain in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, Spain, the Spanish Muslim world was a tremendous economic and cultural success because the rulers, the Islamic rulers, tolerated Jews and Christians. In fact, Islam, in its history then, and indeed throughout most of its history, has been very tolerant of other faiths. It's only recently, in some ways, even in the last century or so, that Islam has become, like Christianity always has been, hostile to other faiths. So I have a friend and colleague at Cato called Mustafa Aykol, Aykol, and he writes very persuasively that there's a liberal tradition in Islam that could be revived. So I urge you to try to do that in Pakistan.
Great. Muhammad Khurram Shabir. Khurram Shabir.
Very nice question, Professor. I just want to ask that Professor has discussed about neoliberalism and all that liberty. I want to ask that one of the foundations, arguably, one of the foundations of neoliberalism. Sorry. So one of the foundations of neoliberalism, arguably, like it's the dominance of the US dollar in the international economy, international
I understand.
Yes. So I just want to ask the professor if he has to defend it, how would he defend it? And
it's hard to hear what you're asking, but as I understand it, you're asking me to respond to the characterization of neoliberalism as the Washington consensus. Is that right?
the dominance of the US currency in the international trade.
That's right. That's right. I understand. But look, maybe Milton Friedman was correct. Let's consider the possibility that what is called by its enemies neoliberalism is in fact the way forward for the world economy. And I would say it is. I would say, look, let's take the case of China. There's no such thing as a Chinese model. We talk about the Chinese model as though, well, let's see, totalitarianism must be a good idea because, look, China has enriched under totalitarianism. But that's quite false. From 1978 on, China adopted liberal economic policies. Now, it certainly didn't adopt liberal political policies, but it did adopt free markets. And that is why China is moved from what? $2 a day income in modern prices to about $50 a day in modern prices. And then in 1991, India, perhaps because of the embarrassment of China doing so well, but also because of the sheer force of ideas and the failure of the license Raj. Since independence, India started to free up the economy. Now, look, I know perfectly well that India still isn't a completely free economy, but it's freer than Pakistan, and it's done very well. There's a claim that it hasn't trickled down to poor people, but that's false. So the neoliberalism, as people want to call it, has worked. Another example, which I know fairly well because I educated a lot of the economists involved, is Chile. Chile is now the richest country in Latin America per capita. And it was nothing like that before my students. And now the sort of tragedy of Chile is that it was imposed by the army. And as what we need to make the world work is not external revolutions imposed by the army or by riots and authoritarianism, but internal revolutions where we come to believe in the dignity of other humans, male, female, gay, straight, rich, poor, and let people alone.
Well, we've got a Chicago economist, one of your former students. Samir Ahmed, go ahead.
Hello, Professor McCloskey.
Hi, how are you, dear?
I'm good. I didn't actually study with you, but I do remember meeting you in Chicago. I was an undergraduate.
But you're
Okay.
but you're shockingly older than you were.
It happens.
Yes, yes. Okay, I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the role of the government. You know, some of the old conventions that the markets know best and so forth. Some of these were just shot out during the financial crisis when we found out that a lot of things probably require a lot more regulation. And more recently, that's probably a concern in the technology sector where you have these huge companies which tend towards monopoly positions and all the repercussions of that. So what is the correct role of the government on the regulatory side?
Well, so far as the financial crisis of 2008 is concerned, that was, in my opinion, mainly because of incompetent government intervention, not because the financial markets themselves were operating badly. The banking industry, to take one part of the financial industry, is the most regulated industry in the United States or Britain and probably in Pakistan too. So the idea that we should impose more regulation on this doesn't sound very sensible to me. So that's one point of view. Now, as far as the natural monopoly of large technology industries such as Facebook and so forth in the modern world, I think it's not economically sensible. Enterprise monopoly is not a serious problem in the modern world. The monopolies that are dangerous and prevalent and increasing are government-sponsored monopoly. Let's take an easy case, taxis. I don't know what the situation in Pakistan is, but I do know that the taxi companies in the United States have all gone bankrupt because of Uber, because of this invention created by the technology industry that's allowed ordinary private cars, essentially, to substitute for taxis. And that's all to the good. Enterprise monopoly, as I argue in this paper that I mentioned, available on my website, it is declining in the last 2 centuries. And the reason it is that transportation cost and transactions costs and transmission costs, information costs, have been falling steadily for 2 centuries. And the result is that the core problem in enterprise monopoly is local monopoly. If you don't have a cell phone, you don't know what the going price of wheat is in the central markets of Pakistan. As soon as you get a cell phone, the local buyer of wheat, the local store, the local wholesaler of wheat can't cheat you anymore. So monopoly goes away as transportation costs fall. Facebook, Google, and so forth are not monopolies. They're very successful firms. They're no more a monopoly than General Motors was for a long time. General Motors in the United States was the major automobile company competing with Ford and to some extent Chrysler. It was and for decades after its formation in the 1920s was a very well-managed firm and was successful because of that. But that didn't make it a monopoly. There were other firms. And indeed, when we stopped having tariffs on the import of automobiles in the United States, starting in the 1960s, again, this falling transaction costs, historically speaking, we got 20 automobile companies instead of 3.5. So the enterprise monopoly is not the problem. State monopoly is the problem.
Ji, Shahid.
Thank you, Professor McCloskey. That was a wonderful lecture. Always been a fan of your writings. Just a few quick questions. One thing, the idea about liberty, personal liberty and ideas. How does, in your view, because there's one other concept, and I'm sure you know that, creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. So, yeah. And how does your view of ideas bringing in change and economic change, how does that correspond to that, or is it different to that? How does it differ, or how is it similar? That I just wanted to know whether my question is that kind of right too, whether it's different, is it same? And second, short question. What's the role of econometrics in today's modern?
Okay, on the first one, entry and exit is a not so scary phrase as creative destruction. Free entry in ideas is crucial. If there are real monopolies, especially government-sponsored monopolies, and censorship that prevents free trade in ideas, we're going to be in grave difficulties in the economy, not to speak of the polity. So, by the way, it was not Schumpeter who came up with that phrase, although he popularized it. It was actually a Marxist economic historian who invented it. But it sounds scary, but it's not. It's what we want in a free society, is free entry and therefore free exit. That is competition. People tend to think, and for a long time they thought of competition as being the same thing as a competition in a cricket match, in which one side wins and the other loses. But that's not what economic competition is. Economic competition, indeed, you go out of business, is one company trying to persuade you to buy its products as against another. And if it's true, if it's a good product, that company will win and the other will lose. So it's good for us. Now, as far as econometrics is concerned, for a person of my PhD generation, I'm well educated in econometrics. But that means that in modern terms, I'm something of an econometric idiot. Because in the meantime, econometrics has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. But I've written a book with Stephen Ziliak called The Cult of Statistical Significance, which argues, in line, by the way, with recent judgments of the American Statistical Association, the official organization of statisticians in the United States, that statistical significance is bankrupt. That I'm not against hyperplanes. Some of my best friends are hyperplanes. I'm not against fitting, but I am against using arbitrary levels of statistical significance as a test of importance. And this is a long argument. It hasn't had much influence in economics yet, but we're correct and they're wrong. And here's the summary conclusion. Statistical significance, t-tests, R-scores, and so forth, is neither necessary nor sufficient for scientific significance, clinical significance, policy significance. Neither necessary nor sufficient.
Fascinating. Not bad. Basmos,
all right, I have a couple of quick questions, and Professor McCloskey, this has been very insightful. Thank you for taking out the time. Since we're talking about ideas, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the idea of mimesis. Reminds me of Richard Dawkins's idea in his book, The Selfish Gene, where he talks about the idea of memes. So if we were to sort of maybe look at a comparison, let's say on Google Ngram of, let's say, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman compared to, for instance, Karl Marx, Foucault, Frantz Fanon, and so on and so forth, you see the latter group rising in popularity over time. How would you explain that development from a sort of philosophical point of view? My second question is, you seem to have benefited quite a bit from socialized healthcare with two hip replacements and so on. But you speak of it as if you were a sort of fringe case, and so therefore it makes it okay. But philosophically speaking, the argument can be made that much more groups deserve that same sort of assistance, and not just the physically disabled, but also at a sort of more abstract level.
Okay.
That might not be
Yes.
endowed with the same
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand.
Thanks.
I understand. On the first, these are not small questions, by the way. These are very, very big questions. I'm not a big fan of Dawkins. The meme idea is okay, but it's not dispositive, as the lawyers say. It's not a sufficiently nuanced way. Dawkins knows really nothing about the things he talks about except biology. He says he doesn't know anything about the humanities, which is where ideas are worked out, but by which I mean philosophy and the study of poetry and so forth. He doesn't know anything about that, and he also doesn't know anything about Christianity and religion generally, on which he has firm opinions and is completely ignorant. If you look at the bibliography of his attacks on Christianity, for example, you'll notice that he doesn't mention any theologians. So I have a low opinion of him. On the other hand, he's got a great book on the evolution of the eye, a short book, which is splendid. So as a popularizer of biology, he's very good. If you want to know where ideas come from, you have to study human culture generally. You can't just say, oh, I got a meme and I'm going to do an engram and boy, now I understand it. Why liberalism arose in Northwestern Europe is a deep historical question, and I've written an entire on it. I regard it as kind of an accident, not something peculiarly reflective of how wonderful Europeans are. That's not where it came from. It's not old. It came in the 18th century and had very few precursors. It didn't come from Christianity. It could equally have come from Islam, and so on. So to do the job right, you can't just run a regression on n-grams. Now, what was the other issue? I've lost track in my enthusiasm. What was the other question, dear?
Abbas, what is the other question? Go ahead.
Yes, the other question was about the sort of like
tell me what it's about.
these things have benefited quite a bit from socialized healthcare.
Okay.
Yeah.
It comes back to me. I get it. Look, but you could just as well go the other way. Of course, I've benefited. That's the joke. Here I am, a liberal who wants state intervention in healthcare to stop. I mean, it's particularly irritating in the United States, because Americans consider themselves to be free market types, and yet the American health system is an enormous pile of state-sponsored monopolies. The national health system in Britain would collapse if it weren't for South Asian doctors and nurses there, people of South Asian descent and sometimes of nationality. So, it's not obvious that because one group of the population has an advantage that everyone should have it. If you want equality of outcome, and in a way we all do. I mean, I want equality of outcome. I'm a believer. I think that souls are equal. But if we want equality of outcome, we're going to get Maoist China. That's what the history says, what the economics says. So it doesn't follow. People think it does, but they're wrong. That because there's part of the world is socialized medicine, it should be bigger. Part of the world has large armies. That doesn't mean that armies should be larger. Pakistan has had terrible problems with its army intervening in politics. That doesn't mean that then we shouldn't say, oh, yes, look, some people have been advantaged by the existence of the Pakistani army, therefore we should increase its size. So no, I don't think that's a sensible argument.
So Professor McCloskey, let me just thank you. I know there are other questions. We'll have to take them later. One last request, because I really want you to, if possible, give us a talk on the bourgeois trilogy. You are fascinated by the bourgeois values, bourgeois destiny, and to you that is the most important component or the most important determinant of the Industrial Revolution, far more so.
Not really. No, that's wrong. That's not a correct characterization of it. What's important is the attitude of the rest of society towards the bourgeoisie. Mm-hmm. I'm not a modern version of Max Weber. He believed that it was the psychology of the bourgeoisie that changed. I don't believe so. I believe that what did change, and that you can show, is that over the last 3 centuries, in some parts of the world, and those are the ones that have economically developed, the attitude of the rest of society towards trade, towards commerce, and especially towards invention has changed in a way favorable to what I call innovism.
My request to you, if possible, is to at some point give us a talk on that, because I think it has ramifications for us in this part of the world, and I'd like to somehow like you to relate that to development policy or development thought, because the related concept is that right now in the old days when the US was developing or UK was developing, they're developing in a world where it was fresh and innovative and new. While we are trying to grow in a world where everything is old and we have jumpstart or leapfrog, and we don't know how to do it. So in that context, I leave it
It's
there.
easy to
Ask you
do.
to reflect on that and give us a time.
Anytime,
Okay.
but it's
Great.
easy
So we'll
to
leave
do.
it for the next. Can you? We can do it. We'll be in touch with you and get a time from you.
Good, indeed.
Thank you very much.
I hope someday to come to Pakistan, which I've always
Please
found an
do.
interesting country.
You
Well,
would be most welcome.
You have to invite me. You have
We'll
to
get
give
you-
me money and not
We will invite.
Clarkson. You have to give me
We'll invite. We'll do.
business class transportation, and you have
We'll
to
do
give
that.
me an
That we'll do.
honorary degree, and then I'll come.
We'll definitely do.
And
Without a doubt,
this is
we'll do
crucial.
that.
This is crucial. Wait. And then a third thing, it's got to be in the cricket season.
This winter we'll do it. That's a promise.
Okay.
All the best, McCloskey. In fact, Professor McCloskey, I'll make sure you get the best seat in the cricket stadium. We'll do it.
Yes.
All the best. Thank you.
Keep a straight bird and watch out for the googlies.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.